How many times have you reached an endgame and not known what to do? You look at the game afterwards and see that you were winning, but you ended up drawing or even losing. Or perhaps you had a drawn position which you ended up losing. If you're like most chess players, it happens a lot. But in this video, I'm going to share everything that I know about the endgame that helped me reach a 2000 rating on chess.com Rapid. Now, of course, this isn't everything there is to know about the endgame. There have been entire books written about the endgame, but I've found that these patterns are the most practical, useful, commonly occurring patterns that, if you know them, it just makes everything so much easier. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. I do all kinds of content on chess, including instructional videos like this one, but lots more. And with that, let's dive into our first position. A king can stop an advancing enemy pawn if it can get inside an imaginary square. Let me show you what I mean. It's black to move. Black advances their pawn to c4, trying to promote. And the winning move for white is not to advance their own pawn. That would actually lose for white. But instead, first to bring their own king closer to try to stop the pawn. The reason this works is because there's this square we can draw from the pawn to where it's trying to promote to, and then across the same number of squares, so 1, 2, 3, 4 down, 1, 2, 3, 4 across, and the white king is able to reach that square, and therefore it's going to be able to stop the pawn, given that the black king is not involved. If black tries to keep on advancing the pawn, we can see that the white king is going to be able to get closer and closer and be able to stop it. Meanwhile, black's own king is not within the same square for the white pawn. So after white has played the king here to stop the black pawn, white will be able to push this pawn all the way because black is not able to get their own king inside the equivalent square. Right? Black to move, black can't get close enough to be within this imaginary square. When there's a king and a pawn against a lone king, there are 3 key squares that the strong side's king needs to try to reach if they're going to secure victory. Where those 3 key squares are depends on whether or not the pawn has crossed halfway. So in this case, the white pawn is on the 4th rank, going up the board, and because of this, the 3 key squares are 2 ranks ahead of where the pawn is. I like to draw a T shape to help me remember this, and it's a long T shape if the pawn has not yet crossed halfway. In this other example, the pawn is 1 rank further ahead. It's on the 5th rank now. And when it has crossed halfway, the location of the 3 key squares changes, and now it's just 1 rank ahead of where the pawn, or a short T shape. So in the first example, where the pawn has not yet crossed halfway, these are the 3 key squares. White wins by playing king c6, therefore reaching one of the key squares. And in this example, the 3 key squares are just 1 rank ahead of where the pawn is, and white wins by playing king d6. Whether you're defending or trying to push for the win in a king and pawn versus king situation, you need to remember the concept of taking the opposition. In this case, it's white that's trying to hold the draw, and with white to move, white should play king b1. Opposition means that the 2 kings are facing each other, like so. And now white should be able to secure the draw. Also applies in this case where white is trying to win. With white to move, white should play king e6, establishing the opposition. Now black doesn't have a good move. If black goes to d8, then we can think about pushing the pawn, king c6, king e7, and the pawn promotes next move. Whereas if the black king were to go to f8, then we reach one of those key squares that we talked about in the last tip. Remember, pawn's crossed halfway, the key squares are 1 rank ahead of where the pawn is. Again, white will win this position. So, look for chances to take opposition in a pure king and pawn versus lone king endgame. Related to the idea of opposition, which we just saw with the kings 1 square apart, is the concept of distant opposition, which is where the kings are either 3 squares apart or 5 squares apart. Always an odd number, either 1, 3 or 5. In this position, black plays king b5 and white has only one move which holds the draw. White should not play perhaps a more natural move, bringing the king closer to the defense. That would actually lose for white because now black gets to take the opposition and black will win. Instead, after king b5, white needs to take the distant opposition, which is with the move king b1, not the first move that comes to mind, if you don't know about this concept. With 3 squares apart, the 2 kings are in distant opposition, and now if the black king tries to come closer, it's white the one who takes the opposition and should be able to hold the draw. One more example to reinforce this concept. Here it's white that's pushing for the win. White plays king e2, and only one move draws for black. Not easy to find if you don't know about distant opposition. It's king e8, going backwards, because king e8 creates distant opposition of 5 squares between the 2 kings. And despite black being a pawn down, with distant opposition, black will be able to draw this. So here we've got another king and pawn versus lone king situation, but this is a special case. Black's pawn, trying to promote on a1, is on one of the 2 side files of the board. That's either the A file or the H file. This gives more resources to draw for the weak side. And the pattern that you need to remember is that the weak side's king needs to reach one of these 2 squares in order to hold the draw, or whatever the equivalent of that would be, right? If the black pawn was instead over on h5, then the 2 key squares would be f1 and f2. This pattern's very useful to remember whenever you're trying to calculate a pawn race. Like, will you be able to get your king to the key defensive square in time? You need to know what those 2 key defensive squares are, and that way you can cut off your calculation a little bit earlier. In this case, white is in time. White can play king c1, therefore reaching one of those 2 key squares, and black will not be able to win this. If black tries to advance their pawn, then white can bring the king even closer into the corner, and there can be some stalemate resources. So that's really all you need to know. If you're defending against a pawn on the edge of the board, just look for these 2 key squares if you're the defender, and if you're the attacker, try to avoid letting the weak side's king reach either of those 2 key squares. Just a really practical rule of thumb here. When you're up by 1 pawn, it's often advisable to trade off all remaining pieces so that you're just left with kings and pawns. So here, white has got 1 extra pawn, and white can secure a totally winning position by playing rook e8 check, therefore forcing the rooks off the board. And now this is an easy win for white. Without this move, if the black rook remains on the board, it's more difficult. Black can try and complicate things and it becomes tricky. But trading the rooks makes it a totally won position for the player with the extra pawn. On the other side of that, with white to move, here, white is down a pawn. Should white trade rooks? No. White should avoid the rook trade. I see so many players who are 1500, 1600, 1700 even, not know this rule, and they'll trade rooks. No, you have to keep the rooks on the board when you're down a pawn. So a move like rook a6 keeps the game going. Still not going to be easy, but white has some hopes of securing a draw so long as the pieces remain on the board. I said in the last tip that a situation with just kings and pawns is winning for the side with the 1 extra pawn. But how? Often it's like this. You sacrifice on the majority side and then win on the other side. So white here has a majority on the queen side, 2 versus 1. The winning plan for white is to create a 1 versus 0. The black king has to try and defend this pawn's advance, allowing the white king to go to the other side. So white's going to lose this pawn. It's a decoy, while the white king goes over here, cleans up the other pawns, and that's going to be an easy win for white. That's how it's done. That's the winning method when you've got a 1 extra pawn in an endgame without any pieces left. Given what we just learnt in the last pattern about king and pawn endgames, you can always consider sacrificing material back in order to gain a king and pawn endgame which you know is winning. Here's a great example of that. Black is the one winning the game here, having an extra exchange, rook for bishop, and black also has an extra pawn. But white is being kind of annoying here. This white king is stopping the pawn from advancing, and the white bishop is anchored by one of its own pawns, and if that bishop doesn't move, then these pawns here can't get going. Many moves win for black here, but the simplest one is the following plan. You give this check, and once the white king moves somewhere, the intention is actually to take the bishop. So you give back the exchange in order to win this king and pawn endgame very easily. It's going to be the same plan. This pawn needs to be looked after by the white king, so if we just play a reasonable looking series of moves here, white's going to have to spend time capturing this pawn, and in the meantime black goes over and wins everything on the other side of the board. Simplest way to win is often to give back material in order to win a king and pawn endgame. Here's another extremely useful endgame pattern to keep in mind. The side that's down a pawn has better drawing chances in general as more pawns are traded. So here we've got 3 white pawns versus 2 black pawns. And with black to move, black can trade one set of pawns with this sequence here, and this situation with 2 white pawns versus 1 black pawn is much more likely for black to draw than the 3 versus 2. This position actually comes from a game between Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand. And Anand, with the black pieces, made the wrong move. Anand played b5 and went on to lose. A pair of connected pawns effectively self-defend each other versus a lone king. So we've got these 2 white pawns here, moving up the board, trying to promote on the 8th rank. The white king's all the way over on the other side of the board, so out of the play, and meanwhile black's king is very close. The problem for black is that the black king cannot take the hindmost pawn, because then the more advanced pawn runs away and becomes a queen. Black king can't catch it, right? So this is a simple example of this pattern, but trust me, this comes up a lot. And knowing to go for a situation like this, where this pawn is effectively immune from capture because then the other pawn will go away and promote, is extremely helpful when you're playing endgames. In a pawn race, every tempo matters. Here we've got black trying to promote their pawn to the g1 square, and we've got white trying to promote their pawns up this way. Let's say that black captures on b5. What should white do? White should definitely not recapture on b5. That'd be a terrible mistake. Instead, white should push their own pawn immediately. Black's going to find themselves one tempo short of being able to queen their own pawn, right? In the equivalent situation where white takes on b5 with the king, white's a move back from where he was in the other line. So black gets to move first, and both sides are going to queen at the same time, and this is going to be a draw. So when you have the chance to push your pawns in a pawn race, do so as fast as you can. Passed pawns can be huge assets in the endgame. White to move here, white can sacrifice to create a passed pawn via g5. The black king is too far away to stop this pawn from advancing, so black's really got a choice between either capturing the pawn or just letting it run away. Let's say that black captures. Well, now the h-pawn is free to advance. White's going to win this pawn race, and therefore is going to win the game. Next example. This comes from Spassky versus Fischer 1966. In this position, Fischer with the black pieces plays g5, and if Spassky were to capture on g5, then Spassky would have lost his passed pawn. So instead Spassky plays h5, keeping the passed pawn. Finally, we've got the outside passed pawn. This comes from Svidler versus Dreyev 2004. The white pawn is about to promote Obviously black can't allow that, so black plays queen to d8, but white goes ahead and plays g8 equals queen anyway, forcing the queen trade. And the point is that white can now create a passed pawn this way. Eventually you're going to be able to play b4, b5, and this passed pawn is going to win the game for white. Advancing a passed pawn can also make it weaker. Now I know that may contradict some of the advice you heard in the earlier tips, but chess is complex and every position is different. I think one difference here is that there's still rooks left on the board, unlike in some of the previous examples where it was down to just kings and pawns. It's already tough for white here. White is down a pawn, but white has this passed pawn going this way. But it goes from difficult for white to being totally lost for white because of the advance played in the game, d5. This actually makes this pawn easier for black to capture. Black in the game forced the rook trade, and now the black king can easily come over and gang up on this pawn and win it. Black will be 2 pawns up with a winning position. So the decision of whether to push a passed pawn is always one that should be taken carefully. A lack of pawn mobility can be fatal in the endgame. So if you get a chance to immobilize the enemy's pawns, you should take it. It's 5 pawns each here, 5 black pawns and 5 white pawns. But is it a draw? Not at all. White has 1 move here, and white needs to find it, otherwise white will actually lose this game. The move that white needs to play is f4. That's to immobilize the black pawns over on the king's side. Obviously it stops the black f pawn from advancing, and it also prevents the black g pawn from advancing, because then white can just take it. Let's see what happens if white plays any other move, for example a5. In that case black will win with the following plan: g5, white really has to take that one, black takes back, and eventually we're going to have that situation we saw earlier where black's going to sacrifice on the majority side, eventually playing g3, and then once white takes it, the remaining black pawn will be used as a decoy for the white king to go over and capture, while the black king comes over here and wins on the other side of the board. King and pawn endgames are extremely tricky, and that's why having knowledge of these concepts is so important. Isolated pawns become weaker as more pieces leave the board. So as you get further and further into the endgame, where more pieces are traded, you should look to target isolated pawns and try and win them. This game comes from Khan versus Bondarevsky, 1937, and here white plays rook d3. Well, black knew what was coming, so played rook d7. White's ganging up on this isolated pawn, forcing the black rooks to become passive. Now, black actually has enough defenders on this pawn, but black is very tied down, and whenever your opponent is tied down in passive defense of an isolated pawn, it can open up opportunities on the rest of the board. And eventually you may even win the pawn. So it's always good practice to target isolated pawns in the endgame. When there's a far advanced pawn, always be on the lookout for tactics that involve promoting it. So white's facing some pressure here by the looks of it. There's a double attack on the g2 square, but white does have this pawn on the 6th rank, and white can force the win by giving up the exchange via rook takes c6. Black has to take back. What else, right? And advancing b7 is possible, but that would allow rook b8, and it's not quite as clean as the alternative. Instead, white can actually sacrifice again with rook takes f7. And when the black rook takes back, this pin means that b7 is now possible and b8 equals queen is unavoidable. Zugzwang is extremely important in endgames, and particularly in pure king and pawn endgames. Zugzwang is a German word. It means compulsion to move. And with white to move here, white plays king e4, and now black is in Zugzwang. Black's king is ideally placed here, and black would like to pass their turn, but the rules of chess don't allow that, black has to make a move, and any move that black makes will make their position worse. If either pawn moves, then it'll just be taken, and if the black king moves backwards, then the white king is going to infiltrate, winning the black pawns and eventually winning the game. So be aware of the concept of zugzwang, and especially as you get into a pure king and pawn endgame situation, be on close lookout for it. Here, black has got a pawn just one square away from promotion, and white is down to just a knight and their king, so the best that white can hope for is to draw this game. The white king is out of the play completely, so the white knight is going to have to defend this pawn's advance all by itself, and here's how it can do it, with what I call the lateral knight defense. Best move for white here is to play knight f2. If the black pawn promotes, then you just take it, and that's a draw instantly. If the black king tries to come around to chase the knight away, well, for a start, that doesn't work because you can actually do this fork and again take the pawn. That's a draw. If the black king tries to go the super long way around to avoid any forks, then, well, let's even just say that the white king just goes back and forth to illustrate what I mean here. Black king comes all the way around and finally gets to the knight. Well, now the knight just goes over here and goes to the other side. Black's not going to be able to make any progress, and the game should be ending in a draw. Note that this works a lot better on the 4 central files. Knights are well known to struggle against pawns on the edge of the board, but the lateral knight defense, where the knight can come to both sides of the pawn, is a useful pattern to remember to hold the draw when you're in this situation. Opposite coloured bishop endgames are notoriously drawish. I'm going to show a few examples as to why this is. Effectively, it comes down to the fact that bishops need to stay on their own colour. You have a light squared bishop and you have a dark squared bishop. So if you've got the two sides with opposite coloured bishops, then there's always going to be one colour complex that they can never influence. And so the defending side can set up blockades on the colour of the square that the strong side doesn't have. Let me show you what I mean. So white is down 2 pawns here, but white still has an easy draw with the move bishop b4. The remaining white pawn is on a dark square, and you're never going to be able to attack that with a light squared bishop. And the white king is also on a dark square. And again, with a light squared bishop, you're never going to be able to shift this white king away from a dark square. Another example here. Black looks like they're completely winning at a glance, right? 2 extra pawns and just a couple of squares away from promoting. But black can't really make progress here. All that white has to do is just keep their bishop on a dark square, and black can never make this d2 advance without the pawn getting lost. All that white has to do is just keep this bishop on this diagonal, and white will hold the draw. Final example, this is called a frontal defense. With white to move here, white can just move their bishop backwards and forwards, and again, black is not going to be able to make progress. The white king is on a light square, black has a dark squared bishop, so you're never going to be able to move this king away. And if black tries to advance their pawn, well, white can give up their bishop for both of black's pawns, and that's going to be a draw. Understand this that the opposite coloured bishop endgame tends to be drawish, so if you've got extra material, be very wary about entering into this, because it can give the defending side a lot of extra drawing resources. So now we've got a same coloured bishop endgame. Both white and black have both got dark squared bishops, and black additionally has this pawn that they're trying to promote on d1. The easiest and safest plan for white is to place their king on a light square, so a square of the opposite colour of the 2 bishops that blocks the pawn's path. So with the move king d1, white's on a square that is blocking the black pawn, and with a dark squared bishop, you're never going to be able to dislodge this white king away from that square. A dead draw, really useful to remember this. in case you find yourself defending in a same-coloured bishop endgame. So what about the winning technique in a same-coloured bishop endgame? White's trying to advance their pawn to b8, and black's king has not been able to reach a square that blockades that. Although the black bishop does prevent white from playing b7. If white did play b7, then black would happily give up their bishop and secure the draw. Instead, the winning plan is to use the bishop as a shield to help the pawn advance. So here white could play bishop c6. Now the pawn can advance. If black chooses to take, then that's fine. The pawn is going to run away and become a queen on the next move. So that's the winning technique. You need to use your king and your bishop in tandem to help the pawn advance towards queendom. Remember how I said opposite coloured bishop endgames are often drawn? Well, often doesn't mean always, as this example illustrates. Bishops struggle to control pawns with wide separation, as is the case here. White's got two pawns on the two edge files, on the A file and on the H file. And this is a particularly painful example for me because it actually occurred in one of my own games. I was playing black here, and white played the move h6. The threat is to move all the way and queen on h8, so I've got to take that one, right? But then that allows the other pawn to advance, and this bishop has been deflected away and can't stop the promotion. And in this position, I of course resigned. That's just a good rule to keep in mind, that bishops struggle to control pawns with wide separation. Having an extra bishop and pawn versus a lone king should be easily winning for the side with the extra material, right? Well, ordinarily, yes, but there's an important exception, which we're going to talk about here. It's called the wrong rook pawn endgame. It's called that because black has a pawn on a rook file, so that's either the A file or the H file. Here it's the H file, and what you've got to do is you've got to compare the colour of the bishop with the colour of the square that the pawn is trying to promote to. Black's got a dark squared bishop and is trying to promote their pawn on a light square, and because the white king is well placed, white's actually going to be able to draw this. Let's just look at a few moves that black could try. H2 check. Okay, the white king's going to go to the corner. If you try and bring the black king closer, then that's actually stalemate and the game ends immediately. But if black just waits with their bishop, then okay, white will just wait with their king. We can play this game for as long as you like, but white is always going to just keep an eye on the pawn's promotion. So it's a very important exception to that rule. If you can see that you're about to enter into a wrong rook pawn endgame, either from the defender or from the attacker's point of view, it can cost you or save you half a point. Here, white's got a queen, and black is desperately hoping to promote their own pawn to restore material equality. But this is the easiest situation for white to be able to stop that, because white can simply play queen e1, and the black king will never be able to approach that queen. White will have time to bring their own king closer, and eventually white will be able to win this pawn and with it the game. Similar situation to the last one. White's got a queen and black's got a pawn one square away from promoting. But this time white has not been able to get their queen in front of the black pawn. So it's a little bit more difficult, but not too hard if you know how. White has to give checks with their queen to force the black king in front of its own pawn. So let's start with queen e3 check. Black really has only two legal moves here. King f1 obviously loses the pawn, so the best try for black is to go in front of the pawn, but that gives white's king time to come closer. Black's going to keep trying probably. They'll play a move such as king c2, but once again, you just give checks. And once the black king goes back in front of its pawn, then the white king comes closer. You repeat this as many times as you need to until eventually the white king gets close enough to the pawn and you can win it and therefore reduce black to resignation. it's not always so simple for the side with the queen. Here it's black with the queen and white with the pawn one square away from promotion. And notably, this pawn is on one of the side files. So the H file in this case, or also the A file would be possible, same idea. So black can try the same approach of checking the white king and forcing it in front of the pawn, but with a pawn on the edge of the board, the threat here is actually stalemate. So black doesn't have time to bring their king closer because right now that position, the white king is stalemated. So black can't do that. Instead, black has to move their queen away, and then given another move, white just moves their king again, threatening promotion. And we can repeat this, but this is going to be a draw with a pawn on the rook's file, the H file or the A file. The other exception is when the pawn is on the bishop's file. Okay, so the white king is now in check. The pawn is one square away from promoting, and white should not go in front of its own pawn. That would be a terrible mistake. That would lose for white. Instead, white should go to the corner with king h8, and now black cannot take this pawn because that position is stalemate as well. So black also doesn't have time to bring their king closer because then white would promote the pawn. So these are the two exceptions, when the pawn is either on the A file or H file, the rook's file, some people find that easier to remember, or on the bishop's file. That will be the F file or the C file. That can give the side with the pawn some extra drawing chances. Here's an important trick to be aware of. White's trying to promote their pawn on G8, but black to move, black plays king F6, seemingly winning because black has two threats now. If white promotes the pawn, then rook A8 is mate. But if white doesn't promote the pawn and instead avoids the checkmate, then the pawn is just lost. But white does have a move here. White promotes the pawn, but promotes to a knight. By promoting with check, white will still have some chances to draw this in a rook versus knight endgame. If you find yourself in a rook versus knight endgame, and you've got the knight, there's really two things you've got to remember. The first one is to keep the knight and the king close to each other, which white can do here with a move such as knight e4. The king and the knight are nice and close together, avoiding any tactics. And the other thing that you need to remember is to keep the king away from the edge of the board, and especially away from the corner of the board. This next position shows how the side with the knight can end up losing if they're forced into the corner. This rook is cutting the black king off, preventing it from escaping. So with black to move, it's hard to suggest a good one here for black. It's actually losing in every line. Knight f8 check. Well, the white king comes even closer, and there's not really anything good that black can play here. For example, king h7, well, rook h2 is mate. So try and avoid the corners, try and avoid the edges of the board if you're the side with the knight, and keep the knight and the king close together. So here we've got an interesting material imbalance. Black's got a rook, and white's got two pawns, moving up the board this way. Who wins? Well, it turns out that with white to move, white will win. White can play b6, and this is the pattern you need to remember, that two connected pawns that reach the 6th rank will outplay a lone rook, assuming that the two kings aren't involved. This rook can't defend both of them. If rook b1, then simply b7. The black rook can try waiting, but then a7. You can take one of the pawns, but you can't stop both of them. White will still need to win the queen versus rook endgame, but in practice this is extremely difficult for a human to hold. The side with the queen should win. So one more time. Two pawns that reach the 6th rank that are connected will outplay a lone rook. When you possess the rook and you're fighting against a pair of connected pawns, then you should almost always use the rook to control the more advanced pawn. So black to move, black plays h3, looking to promote on h1. White has one move here, which wins, and that is rook h8, controlling the more advanced of the two black pawns. Note that this is pretty similar to the last example, but it's not the same. In the last example, it was a pair of pawns that had already reached the 6th rank, so one square further for the other pawn, but it makes all the difference. If we had this situation, black would be winning, but in this situation, white is winning. So small differences in chess can make all the difference. Just one more example of this. With black to move here, black plays b2, trying to promote on b1. Again, white needs to control the more advanced pawn via rook b6. If black promotes the pawn here, then we can take that one and use the king to take the last pawn, thus securing the draw. That's the important thing to remember. Use the rook to control the more advanced of the two connected pawns. Okay, now we get into the famous rook and pawn endgames. Here, both sides have got a rook each, and white additionally has a pawn. Black moves their king back towards the defense, trying to help out, and the winning idea for white is to prevent this with rook f1, cutting the king off along a file. Black's king is not going to be able to cross over the path of the white rook, and therefore isn't going to be able to help defend. This is going to make it much easier for white to win. This time it's black with the extra pawn, trying to promote on h1, currently being stopped by the white rook. The winning idea for black is to, once again, like the last example, prevent the white king from also getting back towards the defense. And this time we're going to do it by cutting the white king off along a rank. With rook h4, the white king is not going to be able to pass beyond the 4th rank, and therefore is not going to be able to get towards the black pawn. This is going to give the black king time to come in and eventually get to push the white rook away, and black will win the game. But it comes from recognizing that you want to stop the defensive king from getting anywhere close to the pawn, either along a file, as we saw in the last example, or along a rank, as we've seen in this example. So here, white's got the extra pawn. This pawn is trying to promote on h8, but white's own rook is blocking the way. The way that white can solve this problem is by giving a check to the black king, and once the black king moves, that gives time for the pawn to promote. That's the simplest example. But what if the black king is on the 7th rank? That means you can't really give this check, because then the black king would just take it. But there is an important trick here, and it's a commonly occurring one too. White can play rook h8, giving up the pawn, but the problem is when black takes it, white's follow-up is a skewer of the black king and black rook. King moves away, rook gets taken, white will win this. So this time it's black trying to promote the pawn, and the white king has only 2 safe squares where it can avoid that skewer idea that we just saw. Remember, if the white king were to step to a square such as c2, then black would have this trick. We just saw that in the last example. To avoid that, white has the 2 safe squares, a2 and b2. White should just keep going backwards and forwards between those 2 squares until the black king makes contact with its own pawn. Once it does that, white should give rear checks. Now the black king can try moving towards the rook, but it's not going to matter too much because the white rook will always be able to find a safe spot to keep an eye on the pawn. The important thing is that the white king has to stay on these 2 squares. What if the side with the extra pawn, that's white in this case, has their king blocking their own pawn's pathway to promotion? The problem that white has is that if they move their king to try and clear the way for their pawn to promote, black is going to give these annoying checks with their rook. And it's actually pretty hard to escape from these checks. If you try and bring the king closer to the rook to challenge it, then the pawn just gets lost. So what do you do? This position is known as the Lucena position, and there's a well-known technique that all strong chess players need to know to win this, but it's a bit counterintuitive if you haven't seen it before. What white needs to do is they need to bring their rook to the 4th rank first before stepping out with their king. Now let's say that black waits. White can now step out with their king, and the difference is that if black does the same thing with all the annoying checks, white is eventually going to be able to block the checks with their rook. This pawn's going to promote on the next move. Oh, well, okay, black could trade the rooks first, but it's not going to make a difference. White makes a queen, and white wins. So here it's black who's got the extra pawn, trying to promote it on d1. White's king is well placed, but white still needs to be careful to hold the draw here. There's a technique to it. It's called the Philidor position. Let's look at the wrong approach first. A very common mistake, if you don't know what to do here, is to give a rear check. But that would allow the black king into d3, threatening checkmate. Let's say that white tries to stop that. Well, the black rook can swing over to the other side, and now it's completely hopeless for white. A move like this doesn't work because you just lose the rook, and you've thrown away a drawn position. So back to the start, what you instead have to do is go to the 3rd rank, okay? This situation works when the pawn is yet to reach the 3rd rank. So white goes to the 3rd rank with the rook and just waits there. Doesn't matter what black does. Black could try giving a check, the white king just steps up, another check, the white king just steps back. This rook is going to just maintain control over the 3rd rank until black tries moving their pawn forward. At that point, white's approach shifts and then goes back. Then goes back to prepare to give those checks from the rear. Let's say that black brings the king in. Now you can give this check. And the difference is that the black king doesn't have the shelter like it had before, right? In this other situation, when the pawn was on d4, the black king could come into d3. But here, that's not possible because the pawn's already advanced. So the black king doesn't have any shelter anymore. You just keep on giving these checks until black gives up, shakes hands, and agrees to the draw. When the situation seems hopeless, be on the lookout for self-stalemating resources to hold the draw. It looks very bad for black here. The obvious threat is rook to c8 mate, and the only possible way that black may have to defend that would seem to be rook to a8, but that move also loses for black. But black does have a resource here. Black has a trick. It's the incredible move rook to g7 check, inviting pawn takes rook, but that's actually a stalemate. Black's king has no legal moves. Whereas if the rook isn't taken, for example, white moves the king away, then black can move their rook away, and the worst of the danger has passed. Finally, the knight and bishop checkmate. Now, there isn't really scope in a short video like this one to explain everything there is to know about how to perform the knight and bishop checkmate. It's very complex and it's very rare, and frankly you don't need to know it in order to get to a rating of 2000. But still, there is one thing that's useful to know, and that is that it can only be performed in a corner of the board of the same colour as the strong side's bishop. So white has a light squared bishop here, and this checkmate has been performed in the light squared corner. The implication for this is if you're trying to avoid being checkmated, let's say you're black here, you want to avoid the dark squared corners, and you know that you are safe in the light squared corners. If you enjoyed this video on endgame patterns, it would be great if you could leave a like down below to show your appreciation. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like more videos like this one, and do feel free to drop a comment down below as well. I'd love to hear from you. I'm Nathan Rose. Good luck with your endgames. Bye for now.